I spent 31 years pricing risk for an insurance consortium before the Dorun ever knocked on my door, and I want that on the record before anything else, because it explains why they picked me and why I said yes. I knew what a residual was. I knew what it meant when a model couldn't be coaxed below a certain error no matter how much you fed it. Most people hear the data will sort itself out eventually and believe it. I never did, not once in 3 decades of actuarial tables, and that turned out to be the only qualification that mattered to the cartographic concordat. They came to Marath Anchor with the continuum engine already built, already humming, already correct about everything that wasn't us. I want to be clear about that too. The engine was not a toy. It modeled the aggregate behavior of 41 member species to 5 decimal places of accuracy, fleet movements, labor negotiations, succession crises, even the slow drift of religious doctrine over 1,000 years, predicted from a few centuries of seed data, and never once meaningfully wrong. Chief Auditor Senoth Vale told me in our first meeting that the engine hadn't failed a calibration test in 1100 cycles. He said it the way another man might mention the sun rising. Not pride, just fact. The audit hall itself was built to make that fact feel inevitable. A long oval chamber, tiered seating on 3 sides for the panel, and at the center a column of light a man could stand inside, where the engine projected whichever century, whichever species, whichever crisis the auditors wanted to examine. The Dorun liked their proof visible. Every session opened with the column dark and ended with it lit, a number floating where the dark had been, and in 1100 cycles the number had always shrunk. I sat through my first 3 sessions saying almost nothing, watching Pell trade ministers settle border disputes exactly the way the engine said they would, watching a soon collective vote ripple through its hive exactly on schedule. And I understood, watching it, why nobody in that room expected anything different from us. They wanted me because humanity was the newest dataset in the Concordat's registry, and new datasets always start noisy. That was the working theory. Feed it enough trial scenarios, enough historical record, enough biometric and behavioral data, and the residual error would shrink the way it always shrank, the way it had for every other species they'd ever onboarded: Dorun, Pell, the quiet hive minds of the Soon collective, all of them eventually folding into a curve that could be trusted. I was there to help build the test scenarios and translate the human angle for auditors who had never sat across a table from one of us. A consultant, a translator, nothing more. The first year, the residual didn't shrink. The auditors weren't worried. 1100 cycles of perfect calibration buys you a great deal of patience. The second year, they ran scenario after scenario through the chamber, staged negotiations, triage simulations, resource allocation dilemmas, anything that would force a subject to choose between a modeled optimal outcome and something else. Watching the logs accumulate was the strangest experience of my professional life, because I recognized what I was looking at before the auditors did. Every other species, when the model handed them the statistically best move, took it at a rate that converged tighter and tighter the more data came in. Humans took it too most of the time, but there was a residual slice, small, consistent, stubborn, where a person would look at the optimal output, understand it perfectly, and choose against it anyway. Not randomly, not from ignorance. Always in the same direction, towards someone else's interest, away from their own, when a relationship was on the table. A labor arbitrator who took a worse settlement so a junior colleague wouldn't be the one blamed for the shortfall. A search coordinator who diverted resources from the statistically larger rescue to the smaller one, because the smaller one included someone she'd trained herself. A contract negotiator who gave up a verified advantage rather than let a partner default first. A ship's engineer, in a scenario built to be airtight, who spent 11 extra minutes of dwindling reactor time walking an apprentice through a repair the model had already flagged as unnecessary for survival, because doing it himself would have been faster and the apprentice would have learned nothing. Auditor Prine Callow, who ran most of those simulations personally, told me she assumed at first the scenarios were poorly designed, too much ambiguity, too many confounds, so she tightened them. Stripped the language down until a subject couldn't misread the stakes, removed every variable except the one that mattered, ran the same dilemma 40 different ways with 40 different surface details. The residual didn't move. It sat there, 4/10 above the floor, as stable as anything else the engine had ever measured. By the third year, the chamber had stopped calling it noise. Senath Vale presented the cumulative figures to the full audit panel himself, and I remember the room going very still in the particular way a room goes still when professionals realize a number isn't an error bar, it's a finding. Across 900,000 simulated decision cycles, drawn from every demographic stratum they could sample, the model's prediction error for humans never fell below 4.1%. And that 4.1% always pointed the same way. Every other species in the registry calibrated to a residual under 0.1%. We were the only outlier in 1,100 cycles of operation, and we weren't noisy. We were structured. Something in us was choosing, on purpose, against the model's own definition of our interest, often enough and consistently enough to be its own variable. And the engine had no slot in its architecture for a variable like that. That was when they decided to test me. I want to say I objected for the report, but I didn't, not really. I understood what they needed, and I understood by then that I already knew the answer they were afraid of. They built the scenario with full access to 31 years of my own actuarial work, my financial history, my medical file, every recorded decision I'd made since the Concordat first opened my file. They told the room and told me that the engine had ingested all of it and produced a single predicted choice for a scenario it had designed specifically for me. A final consulting payment, substantial, contingent on my recommending the project be wound down as a failure and walking away clean. The alternative staying on, unpaid past contract, to keep working the human residual with Prine Callow, who by then I'd spent 3 years arguing with in that chamber and had come, without planning to think of as something closer to a colleague than a supervisor. The engine gave its prediction to the full panel before I was told what it was. Senath Vale read it aloud, 91.4% confidence that I would take the payment. I took the empty chair across from Callow instead. I told the room I'd stay on, unpaid, until the residual either closed or got a name. I didn't say it for effect. There wasn't a version of the decision where I walked. Nobody applauded. Nobody gasped. Dorun don't make those sounds, and after 3 years working that chamber I'd have been more unsettled if they had. What happened instead was quieter and, I think, worse for them. Senath Vale sat with the failed prediction displayed above the table for a long time, not speaking, while around him the panel did what auditors do when a number won't behave. They checked the inputs twice, found nothing wrong with the inputs, and then simply stopped checking because there was nothing left to check. The engine hadn't been short on data. It had been short on a category. It didn't have anywhere to put the fact that a person could look at the better outcome for himself, name it correctly, and set it down anyway because of who else was sitting at the table. Prine Callow filed the closing entry herself, in front of me, in the flat clerical register the Concordat uses for findings it doesn't know how to qualify. Residual not attributable to data insufficiency. Recommend reclassification of subject variable from noise to structural unknown. Recommend the human dataset be flagged for permanent review, not resolution, because resolution assumes the gap is meant to close. I read it over her shoulder and told her it was a fair summary. She asked, in the dry way she developed after 3 years of putting up with me, whether I had anything to add for the record. I told her the 4.1% wasn't a flaw in the species. It was the only number in the whole engine that meant anything to us on purpose. She didn't write that part down, but she didn't erase it from the log either, and on a Concordat panel in that particular silence, that was its own kind of verdict.